August 2025. An altitude of 7,000 meters, Peak Pobeda. A broken leg, a tent torn apart by the wind, and almost zero chance of rescue. The story that shook the entire mountaineering world began with an ordinary commercial ascent. Events unfolded rapidly and elicited a huge response among climbers. Natalia Nagovitsina was stranded at 7,000 meters with a broken leg while attempting to summit Peak Pobeda. It all happened in a matter of days, and there is still no complete clarity. The participants in those events are still silent. The details of what transpired on the slope remain in the shadows. But it is possible to reconstruct the timeline as far as the available facts. To understand the scale of what happened, we must go back in time. Natalia's name first appeared in the public sphere in the summer of 2021. That August, she and her husband, Sergei Nagovitsin, set out for Khan Tengri, a 7,000er with a height of 7,010 meters. The ascent began as planned. The weather held, acclimatization went well, and the rope team worked in harmony. At an altitude of 6,800 meters, everything changed in a matter of minutes. Sergei suddenly fell ill. Natalia contacted the base camp by radio, where a doctor was on duty. The voice on the air was calm and professional. The doctor had worked in the mountains for many years and was used to emergency calls at high altitude. After listening to the description of the symptoms, he suggested a stroke. The diagnosis was made blindly, based on indirect signs, but the doctor knew. At such an altitude, any delay in blood circulation to the brain develops rapidly. The man was lying at an altitude of nearly 7 kilometers in critical condition, unable to move on his own. Her strength alone would clearly not have been enough to evacuate him. At 6,800 meters, the air contains less than 40% of the oxygen found at sea level. Every movement requires effort. Every step drains the last of one's strength. To drag an adult man down a steep slope alone is physically impossible. A conversation followed, a recording of which later spread across the internet. The operator's voice was tinged with fatigue. He understood what he was saying, and he understood that Natalia understood everything as well. What is your position? Under the dome, above 6,800. How is he feeling? He can't stay sitting up. He keeps falling over. His speech is slurred. A pause. Only the sound of the wind and static could be heard on the air. Natasha, descend alone. You can't help him anyway. Do you copy? Over. I copy, but I can't leave him. Another pause. Somewhere below, in the warm base camp, people exchanged glances. Everyone knew how this would end, but no one could force a person to abandon her dying husband. Natasha, respond to south. Do you hear me? You need to descend. The weather is getting worse. It will be dark soon. I won't abandon him. He's completely helpless. I'm giving him water. Natasha, were you able to dig a snow cave? It didn't work out. There's almost no snow. At such an altitude, snow is either scoured by the wind down to ice or compacts into a dense mass that cannot be dug without a saw. There is nowhere to take shelter. The temperature after sunset will drop to -30, maybe even lower. Without a tent, without shelter, in thin sleeping bags designed for movement, not for bivouacking. Base, respond. Over. My husband is doing very poorly. He's freezing, not moving. Over. Natasha, hang in there. People are coming up as fast as they can. They're not robots, they're ordinary climbers. Natalia refused to abandon her dying husband. A night in the cold at a tremendous altitude awaited her. A night at 6,800 meters is not the romance of a starry sky and mountain landscapes. It is a struggle for every breath, every heartbeat. At such an altitude, the body operates at its limit, slowly breaking down from the lack of oxygen. Brain cells die off. The heart beats faster. The lungs cannot cope. At night, body temperature drops, and uncontrollable shivering begins. Muscles cramp from the cold and dehydration. The mouth becomes so dry it's impossible to swallow. Water in the flask freezes. Fingers and toes lose feeling. The first stage of frostbite begins unnoticed. On the morning of August 9th, rescuers reached them. The ascent took all night. The group moved in the darkness, by the light of their headlamps, securing themselves at every section. Above 6,000 meters, every meter of altitude is gained with difficulty. Copy found them both, alive, both. Natasha is walking on her own, the man cannot. They were found alive. Natalia had spent the night at high altitude, warming her husband with her body, giving him sips of water, massaging his frozen hands. But Sergei died during the descent. At 6,400 meters, he stopped breathing. Rescuers tried to resuscitate him, but at such an altitude, it is almost pointless. The heart simply refuses to start in the thin air. They managed to save Natalia. She descended on her own 2 feet, with frostbitten fingers, dehydrated but alive. Afterward, she shared her memories, and in her words, one could hear not trauma, but a kind of detached statement of fact, as if she were talking about someone else's life. At first, everything went like clockwork. On the day of our arrival, we went straight to the Oxide travel office. We filled out the paperwork, bought groceries. They said, "We leave tomorrow." We were lucky with the plane, too. We arrived in the evening, weighed ourselves with our gear. By 6 in the morning, the helicopter was there. We didn't have to wait at all. We were literally in Bishkek on the 3rd day and 2 days later at South Inalchek. Such speed is a rarity for the Tian Shan. Usually, one spends several days at base camp waiting for weather, acclimatizing. But sometimes everything aligns perfectly. A weather window, an available helicopter, a ready group. They asked about our experience. We were prepared. We brought our climbers' logbooks. He looked at who our coach was and immediately relaxed. "All right, go ahead, since you know how to Jumar." That's what he said. To Jumar is to ascend a fixed rope using ascenders. It's a basic skill in high-altitude mountaineering. If you can Jumar, it means you're not a tourist with zero experience, that you at least know the basics of the technique. On the 3rd day, we climbed to the first camp, set up our tent. There we met the 3rd participant, an Italian. He had come alone, only spoke English. Nobody around knew the language. He couldn't even find out the weather forecast. He didn't have a radio, didn't even know you could rent one. He couldn't find anything out from his neighbors. He came up to us, asked about the weather. We told him. It turned out that since he was alone, he had no rope team, no rope. We said, "Join us tomorrow. We're going to climb the bottle." That's how we met. From then on, the Italian moved with us. The bottle is a slang name for a section of Khan Tengri, a narrow ice couloir shaped like the neck of a bottle. Technically difficult, but passable. It often happens in the mountains. A lone climber joins a group, and no one refuses. Because in the mountains, there is an unwritten rule: help while you can, because tomorrow you might need help yourself. After that, we climbed almost without stopping. I was in front, he was on the rope behind me. I would turn around periodically. He just kept saying, "Go, go." What? Like, don't stop. So we kept moving. Then we decided to take a break, have some tea. We stopped at a station. He says, "Let me go first." I say, "Okay, go ahead." He climbed 2 rope lengths and stopped. I thought, it seems too early for a break. We were just sitting. All right, I thought. Maybe he needs to adjust something. I climb up to him, ask what's wrong. The tragedy was, he'd been hit by frostbite. Why is still a mystery. Hit by frostbite, meaning frostbite had set in. Sharply, suddenly, without warning. It happens like this. A person is walking normally, nothing hurts, nothing is bothering them, and then, suddenly, their fingers have turned to wood. Circulation is disrupted, blood vessels constrict, and the process begins. At high altitude, this happens faster than at lower elevations. You know, it's strange, but I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid of becoming disabled, of getting frostbite and having my arms and legs amputated. What would I do then? That scared me the most. Probably the scariest thing. Exactly that. But the thought that we might die? No. This is a typical reaction for people in extreme situations at high altitude. Death seems like an abstraction, a distant prospect, but disability is concrete and terrifying. Because you imagine yourself without fingers, without hands, and you understand that life will become completely different. Then I was talking to the doctor, and I said, "No, we're staying." My husband told me, "They know better. Go, if they say so. They know better." I said, "Don't give me a hard time. Not now. I've made my decision. That's it." After that, my husband hugged me, and I realized it was the right decision. In that hug was everything: forgiveness, gratitude, understanding. Sergei knew that he was condemning his wife to die with him, but he was grateful that he would not die alone. A year later, Natalia returned to Khan Tengri and placed a memorial plaque in memory of her late husband. The ascent was difficult. Every turn of the path, every familiar rock brought back memories. She climbed alone, carrying a metal plate with Sergei's name. She installed it on the spot where he died. She stood in silence, looking at the glacier below. Then she turned around and descended. Now, about what happened this year. In August 2025, Natalia Nagovitsina flies to Kyrgyzstan to climb Peak Pobeda, the country's highest point, at 7,439 meters. She wanted to dedicate this ascent to the memory of her late husband, Sergei, as well. For her, it was not just a mountaineering project, but a way to finish what they had started together. Some sources wrote that she was with a commercial group, having paid 400,000 rubles for the organization. In principle, this is realistic. Such tours are convenient. Everything is organized. Transfers, food, and camp setup are handled without your involvement. The price for such a service is quite reasonable. You just arrive with your backpack. They meet you, take you to base camp, feed you, acclimatize you on a schedule, and lead you on the route. For those who don't want to deal with logistics and bureaucracy, this is the optimal choice. Information circulated in the press that Natalia was an inexperienced climber, rarely went to the mountains, and understood nothing about mountaineering. This is an outright lie, spread by journalists who have never held an ice axe. The ascent of Pobeda was intended to complete the Snow Leopard program, an honorary title in Russian mountaineering awarded for summiting the 5 7,000ers of the former USSR: Lenin Peak, Korzhenevskaya Peak, Communism Peak, Khan Tengri, and Peak Pobeda. This is a serious mountaineering achievement. You don't get it just like that. She had more than serious experience. Natalia is climbing the mountain in a team of 2 rope teams, she and a climber named Roman. The second rope team consists of 2 foreigners, Italian Luca Sinigaglia and German Günther Zsigmond. Natalia had known Luca before. They met on Con Tengri 4 years earlier, where the Italian had helped bring the injured couple down. The Italian climber's sister, Patrizia, said that the experience had brought them very close. After the climb, they talked a lot, corresponded, and arranged to meet on some summit. Luca was an experienced high-altitude climber, had been to the Himalayas, and knew what it meant to work at 7,000 meters. On August 12th, the climbers begin their summit push for Peak Pobeda. They are scheduled to leave the assault camp at 2 in the morning, standard practice for high-altitude ascents. You have to climb in the dark to be higher up by dawn, and to be descending by midday when the sun heats the slopes and rockfall begins. Günther Zsigmond successfully summits. The German was climbing strongly, confidently, with a good reserve of energy. He reached the highest point, took a few photos, and turned to descend. Luca Sinigaglia turns back earlier, abandoning the ascent. Rescuer Alexander Semyonov later recounted, Luca turned back and stayed in a snow cave at an altitude of 6,900 meters on the ridge, about halfway. After the summit, Günther descended to the cave and found Luca exhausted. He was resting, recovering. Perhaps the Italian was developing mountain sickness, or perhaps he simply ran out of energy. At such an altitude, the body works to its absolute limit, and it's impossible to predict when that limit will be reached. Both foreigners head down to the assault camp. The rope team of Roman and Natalia Nagovitsina also moves toward the summit. Roman ascends Peak Pobeda. Natalia follows. Whether she was on the very summit is not entirely clear. Some sources claim she was, others that she turned back a few dozen meters from the highest point. In any case, she completed the main part of the route. During the descent on the narrow ridge connecting the main summit of Peak Pobeda with Vajepshavela Peak, a tragedy occurs. Natalia falls and breaks her leg. This ridge is one of the most dangerous sections of the route. Narrow, icy, with sheer drops on both sides. The slightest mistake, the slightest loss of balance, and you are flying down. Natalia falls at an altitude of 7,140 meters at the very beginning of the 4-kilometer ridge between the two peaks. Her partner, Roman Makrinsky, slips twice on the narrow pre-summit ridge. He stops the first fall himself, driving his ice axe into the slope with all his might. The rope goes taut, the jolt hits his body, but the belay holds. The second fall occurs a few minutes later. During the second fall, Natalia, belaying him, absorbs the shock and falls herself, hitting the ice. The crack in her leg is audible even through the howl of the wind, a fracture. Pain at 7,000 meters feels different than at lower altitudes. It doesn't come immediately, but in waves, after a few seconds. First just numbness, then a sharp flash, then a dull, crushing weight. The leg doesn't obey, doesn't bend. It becomes a dead weight. Natalia realizes she cannot descend on her own. Roman administers first aid, gives her painkillers, ketorol, ibuprofen, everything in the first aid kit. He tries to immobilize her leg with a makeshift splint from an ice axe and trekking poles. But at such an altitude, even simple actions drain the last of one's strength. His hands tremble, his fingers don't obey, his breathing becomes ragged. He drags her under a rock at the beginning of the ridge, a place relatively sheltered from the wind. At least it's not as exposed there. At least you can hide from the direct blast of icy air. An altitude of 7,140 meters is extremely difficult for rescue operations, especially not on a gentle slope, but on a narrow ridge with complex rock sections. You can only move one by one, with careful belaying at every step, Otherwise, there's a risk of falling into a multi-kilometer abyss. Carrying a person is physically impossible. You only have enough strength to move your own body. Every step is a battle against gravity, against the wind, against the lack of oxygen. Roman makes the only correct decision: leave Natalia, descend to the camp for help. There is no other way. To stay with her means condemning both to death. Descending together is impossible. She cannot move. He leaves her his sleeping bag, a thermos with the last of the hot tea, and a few energy bars. He promises to return with help as quickly as possible. Natalia is left at a tremendous altitude, without a tent, with a broken leg. A cold night awaits her. A night at 7,000 meters is a slow death. The temperature drops to -35. The wind intensifies, cutting through all layers of clothing. The sleeping bag helps, but it doesn't save her. It's designed for use inside a tent, not on an open ridge. The body begins to cool. First the extremities, then the core. Consciousness becomes confused. Thoughts become sluggish and slow. Roman descends to the assault camp, where the foreigners, Günther and Luca, are, and reports the incident. He reaches the camp in a few hours, completely exhausted, with frostbitten fingers. Luca, who was obviously friends with Natalia, hearing the news, immediately prepares for a rescue. He doesn't hesitate, doesn't weigh the chances. He just gets up and starts packing his backpack. Günther joins him. The next day, August 13th, the German and the Italian head for the summit. The ascent is difficult. They have already spent their energy on yesterday's summit push, haven't had time to recover, and now they are climbing up again, carrying extra gear: a tent, a sleeping bag, a stove, gas, food. Every extra kilogram at this altitude feels like 10. They reach Natalia with enormous difficulty. By that time, she has already spent more than a day on the ridge. Completely exhausted, they are forced to spend the night nearby. But they bring a sleeping bag, a stove, a gas canister, some food, and most importantly, they set up a tent. A small two-person tent, but it is shelter, protection from the wind. This could help her hold on until rescuers arrived. As already mentioned, a manual descent is practically impossible due to the difficult terrain, not just the altitude. To bring a person with a fracture down such a ridge would require a team of at least 6 to 8 experienced, acclimatized, high-altitude climbers with a full set of rescue equipment. It would require a stretcher, pulley systems, dozens of meters of rope, and anchor points at every section. This would take days, maybe a week. And the weather on Peak Pobeda does not grant you a week. Roman Makrinsky, Natalia's partner, reportedly also sustained injuries and frostbite during his falls, and begins his descent to the lower camp at 4,800 meters at the end of the icefall. He descends slowly, with stops, barely feeling his legs. Günther and Luca are forced to leave Natalia again and return to a safe camp. To stay with her means to perish themselves, because their food and gas are running out, and without hot drinks, you cannot survive at such an altitude. During the descent, Luca loses a mitten. It was torn off by the wind. He didn't even have time to react. His hand instantly begins to freeze. He suffers severe frostbite on his hand. His fingers first turn white, then blue, then lose all feeling. Despite this, on August 14th, Luca, along with Günther, decides to attempt a second rescue. His hand is swollen and hurts so much he wants to scream, but he prepares to go up again, because his friend was left up there, someone who had once survived a similar nightmare, and he cannot simply abandon her. On August 14th, with a frostbitten hand, Luca Sinigalia and the German Gunther Siegmund try to reach her via Vajapshavela Peak, but are caught in bad weather. The weather in the mountains changes in minutes. An hour ago it was clear, and now there is zero visibility, the wind knocking them off their feet. A severe blizzard forces them to spend the night in a snow cave at an altitude of 6,800 meters. They dig the cave with their hands and ice axes, scraping ice out of a natural depression in the rock. The conditions inside are slightly better than outside, at least the wind isn't blowing directly on them. The conditions worsen with each hour. A powerful wind picks up, and the temperature at night drops below -30. The gas runs out. The last portion of hot water was drunk in the evening. Dehydration intensifies, lips crack, the tongue swells. Trapped in the cave by the storm, the foreigners contact base camp by radio, asking for a doctor's consultation. Luca speaks with difficulty, stammering, confusing words. Based on the described symptoms, the doctor suspected the onset of cerebral edema in the Italian: headache, nausea, confusion, loss of coordination. He ordered an immediate descent because cerebral edema at altitude develops rapidly and ends fatally. But Luca is no longer able to move on his own. Gunther tries to lift him, but the Italian falls back, unable to stand on his feet. On the morning of August 16th, weakened by severe frostbite on his hand and progressing cerebral edema, Luca Sinigalia dies in the snow cave. His body is still somewhere at an altitude of 6,800 meters, covered by snow. Climber Alexander Semyonov later stated, "Before his death, he was in terrible agony. He tried to throw himself off the cliff, from the walls of the cave. He tried to get rid of his hand. It was very difficult, really." Where Semyonov got this information is unknown. Perhaps Gunther told him later when he descended and recovered. Perhaps it is a reconstruction based on circumstantial evidence. Cerebral edema at altitude is one of the most terrifying ways to die in the mountains. Consciousness becomes confused, hallucinations begin. A person ceases to perceive reality adequately. They might undress in the freezing cold, try to throw themselves out of a tent, or start mutilating themselves without feeling pain. Natalia Nagovitsina remains in the tent on the ridge of Peak Pobeda all this time. It is now the 5th day at altitude. The food ran out long ago, as did the water. Snow can be melted in the mouth, but this draws heat from the body, accelerating hypothermia. The broken leg is swollen. The boot cannot be removed. Frostbite on her fingers is likely already irreversible. The head of the base camp, Dmitry Grekov, answered journalists' questions harshly and bluntly. "There's no need to search. We know where she is. It's just impossible to get there." Nobody has ever been taken off from there in the entire history of ascents. It's impossible to bring her down by hand, only by helicopter. There are no such helicopters in Kyrgyzstan. This is true, and every experienced high-altitude climber understands it. The victim was lying at an altitude of over 7,000 meters. Helicopter rescue operations are rarely conducted above 6,000 meters. The air there is so thin that the lift of the rotors drops sharply. It requires special equipment, professional pilots with experience in high-altitude flights, and insane courage from the crew. The probability of not returning from such operations is extremely high. The lift of a helicopter at an altitude of 7,000 meters drops so much that the machine is practically unable to hover, let alone take on additional weight. The air currents in the mountains are so unpredictable that even experienced pilots are often smashed against the rocks. The wind can throw a helicopter into a wall in a second, and no reaction can save it. In the Himalayas, somewhere in Nepal, where commercial mountaineering is well established and completely different money is involved, finding such a helicopter and a pilot willing to risk it is, of course, easier than in Kyrgyzstan. There are companies specializing in high-altitude rescue operations, pilots with experience flying to Everest, and equipment adapted for extreme conditions. Despite this, on August 16th, another evacuation attempt was made with the participation of the Kyrgyz authorities. The Ministry of Defense sent an Mi-8 helicopter, a workhorse, a reliable machine, but not designed for work at such altitudes. In addition to the crew, there were 6 rescuers on board, including climber Vitaly Akimov, who was presumably leading the operation. The task: to pick up the German climber Gunther, who was still in the snow cave next to the body of his Italian comrade, and to provide assistance to Roman, who was also not in the best condition. If the weather and altitude permitted, to fly as close as possible to Natalia so that the rescuers could somehow get her on board. It was a desperate attempt. Everyone understood that, but it was worth a try. By the way, the weather in those days was atrocious. During the day, the temperature rarely rose above -24 degrees, with strong winds, with gusts up to 40 meters per second. Visibility changed every hour, sometimes relatively clear, sometimes a complete whiteout. The helicopter enters a zone of turbulence on its approach to the high-altitude camp. The machine starts being thrown around like a toy. The pilot tries to stabilize it, but an air pocket sucks the helicopter down. It makes a hard landing on the slope above 4,000 meters. On landing, the fuselage hits the slope hard. The screech of metal and screams inside the cabin can be heard. The rescuers themselves ended up in a bad situation. They now needed to be rescued themselves. Moreover, almost everyone on board sustained injuries from the impact. The pilot, a compression fracture of the spine, one of the most severe injuries. A rescuer from the company Oxide Travel, a dislocated hip, unable to stand. The others, bruises, sprains, possible rib fractures. There is a suggestion that it was Oxide Travel that sold the tour to Nagovitsina for those same 400,000 rubles. That is why many media outlets later wrote that it was a private company, not official rescuers, conducting the rescue, hinting at irresponsibility and incompetence. This is untrue and a manipulation. The fact is that rescue work at such an altitude is in any case carried out by climbers, not by state rescue services. State rescuers do not have experience working at altitudes above 5,000 to 6,000 meters and do not keep high-altitude climbers on staff just in case. It is economically unfeasible to maintain a team of professionals for rare cases. Almost all high-altitude rescue operations in mountains around the world are a form of volunteerism by those who are nearby, willing to help, and possess the necessary skills. The rescuers are the climbers themselves who are in the area at the time, not some mythical professional rescuers with helicopters at the ready. The helicopter makes a hard landing. Everyone sustains injuries of varying severity. Climber Vitaly Akimov, a back injury, painful but allowing movement. The rescuers themselves need to be evacuated. However, part of the crew and rescuers who can still walk leave the crashed helicopter and head towards the distressed climbers. They move slowly, through pain, belaying each other. They successfully retrieve Roman Makrinsky and the German Günther Zygmunt, who by that time had already descended from the cave to an altitude of 5,300 meters. The German walks on his own, with difficulty, but he walks. Roman can barely stand on his feet. A second, more powerful Mi-17 helicopter is quickly dispatched for them. The pilot acts cautiously, knowing the fate of the first aircraft. The injured, the Russian Roman and the German Günther Zygmunt, are taken to a hospital in Bishkek. According to the Mountaineering Federation, Zygmunt's condition is assessed as serious. Severe frostbite on his extremities, possibly requiring amputation of fingers and toes. General exhaustion, dehydration, and the initial stage of pulmonary edema. Vitaly Akimov, despite the back injury sustained in the hard landing, remains on the mountain, directing further rescue efforts. This requires incredible willpower. Every movement sends pain through his spine, but he understands, if he leaves now, the coordination of the operation will fall apart. At that moment, on August 16th and 17th, many experts and climbers assumed that Nagovitsina had already died. The low temperatures, hurricane-force winds, minimal food and water, a serious injury, and an altitude of over 7,000 meters, all of this did not bode well. The human body is not designed to survive in such conditions for more than 2 or 3 days. On August 18th, in the Telegram channel Mountain Incidents, where the mountaineering community gathers, Natalia's sister, Yulia Lakova, wrote, "The rescuers who were going to go to her are now busy bringing down other guys who are frostbitten but walking on their own. She can't move. Time is working against her. I don't know how much food and gas she has left. They won't give me the base camp manager's phone number, so it's unknown when or if help will be provided to my sister at all. Please help if you can." What is Yulia talking about? The fact that the rescue services of Kyrgyzstan were not idle all this time, but rather were catastrophically overloaded with work. They were rescuing not 1 or 2 people, but a huge group. Note, 62 climbers were simultaneously in distress due to a sharp deterioration in the weather. The press service of the Ministry of Emergency Situations of Kyrgyzstan reports in dry, official language. Military pilots of the Air Defense Forces of the Kyrgyz Republic are involved in the operation. The day before, the weather finally allowed the resumption of rescue operations after a 3-day break. 2 helicopters of the Ministry of Defense completed 6 flights to the epicenter of the events, to the South Inalchek and Poliana base camps. 62 rescued climbers, tourists, and rescuers were successfully transported to a safe zone. 30 people were evacuated from the North Inalchek camp, citizens of Great Britain, China, Kazakhstan, Russia, and Kyrgyzstan. The body of a Russian citizen, Alexei Ermakov, 38 years old, who died on August 16th in the area of Khan Tengri Peak during an ascent attempt, was also transported down. Some of the injured with injuries and frostbite were sent to medical institutions in Bishkek for qualified assistance. To put it mildly, the rescuers and pilots had more than enough work. Priority was given to those who could be physically reached and who could realistically be saved. A rational, harsh approach. Save those who have a chance. Besides, many experts were already publicly stating at that time, Natalia Nagovitsina was most likely long dead. However, on August 17th, they managed to launch a drone with a camera. A quadcopter, a regular, commercial one, but adapted for flights at high altitude. The drone flew close enough to the tent on the ridge for the operator in the base camp to make out details, and he saw Natalia was waving her hand. Slowly, weakly, but she was waving. A figure in a bright down jacket was visible. Movement was visible. Therefore, on the 5th day after the fracture, having spent almost a week at an altitude of over 7,000 meters, she was still alive. This changed the situation. The rescue operations, which were about to be called off, were decided to be continued. There was hope. On August 19th, the drone was again able to get as close as possible to the location. The weather had improved slightly. The wind had died down. The footage from the camera showed a more alarming picture. Natalia was lying in a sleeping bag, barely moving. Whether she was sleeping then, had lost consciousness, or was no longer breathing, it was difficult to determine with certainty. The tent was partially torn by the wind, one side of the fabric flapping in the wind, the entrance open. Even if she was still alive, it was obvious that there was practically no food or water left, and she had surely already suffered the most severe frostbite on all her extremities. 7 days at such an altitude, without hot food, without the ability to move, this is beyond human capabilities. Alexander Yakovenko, chairman of the Classic Mountaineering Commission of the Russian Mountaineering Federation, commented to journalists a few hours after receiving this footage. The rescuers physically cannot reach the location due to the continuing bad weather. Contact with the victim was lost several days ago. It is unknown whether she is alive or not. Rescue operations are ongoing constantly. They have not stopped for an hour. But due to the storm force wind and poor visibility, the group cannot yet climb above the 6,400-meter mark. Another official message from rescuers on the same day. The female climber is lying in a sleeping bag at an altitude of approximately 7,000 meters on the ridge of Peak Pobeda. The air temperature in the incident area is -23 degrees Celsius, which feels like -40 with the wind chill. According to preliminary information, a group of rescuers from the Kyrgyz Republic was supposed to set out on Tuesday to the location where the Russian climber is. However, the ascent from the nearest safe camp could take from 5 to 6 days under ideal weather conditions. One of the closest camps to the incident site on Peak Pobeda, from which it is technically possible to start a rescue operation, is the South Inalchek camp, located 3.5 kilometers lower vertically. At the moment, several experienced high-altitude climbers are gathering as a separate group, independent of the official rescuers, to set out on a search. The victim's tent is located in approximately the same basin on the ridge where several years ago the Russian climber Mikhail Ishutin died. His body has still not been evacuated. The place is technically inaccessible for a descent by human power. From the point where the victim lies, there is a long, technically difficult ridge. In ideal weather, a large, strong, well-acclimatized team of 8 to 10 people would need at least a couple of days to organize a descent using pulley systems and a stretcher. Some of the rescuers who participated in the operation to evacuate the German and Russian climbers sustained serious injuries in the helicopter crash and will not be able to physically participate in further operations. With each day, the average temperature on the peak drops. The end of the climbing season is approaching. For tomorrow, forecasters predict a drop to -26 degrees and snowfall with strong wind. Natalia no longer shows any signs of life. The drone circles above the tent. The operator tries to spot any movement, but there is nothing. Only the fabric of the tent flapping in the wind. The Italians get involved in the story. The death of Luca Sinigaglia shook the Italian mountaineering community. Their media publish urgent reports. 3 experienced Italian climbers have already flown to this region of the Tian Shan to try to save the Russian climber Natalia Nagovitsina, who has been at a critical altitude for more than a week due to a broken leg. Our compatriot Luca Sinigaglia died trying to help her. According to information sources in Kyrgyzstan, radio contact with the Russian climber was completely lost several days ago. Therefore, her real fate after the long time that has passed since the incident remains unclear. It is not ruled out that she has already died, but this can only be definitively established upon physical contact. The Italians do not just express condolences, they act. They are preparing to fly in a special Airbus H-125 helicopter, formerly known as the Eurocopter AS-350, which, unlike the Soviet Mi-8, is designed specifically for high-altitude operations and can operate relatively stable at altitudes up to 7,500 meters. Most importantly, this machine will be flown by two Italian pilots with vast experience in high-altitude rescue operations. One of them, according to several sources, was Simone Moro, a legendary figure in the world of high-altitude mountaineering, a man who climbed with Anatoly Bukriv on Annapurna in the 90s, and has now been working for many years as a rescue pilot in the Himalayas, based in Nepal. Super professional guys with thousands of high-altitude operations and hundreds of saved lives behind them. But to fly, official permission from the Ministry of Emergency Situations of Kyrgyzstan is needed. Bureaucratic procedures, approvals, permission to fly in a border zone. The Italians wait. On August 19th, a group of 8 experienced and physically well-prepared climbers finally set out for the victim. Acclimatized, with a full set of equipment, determined. But due to the strengthening wind, blizzard, and deep, loose snow on the slopes, the group could not break through above the 6,600-meter mark. Visibility dropped to 0. The wind knocked them off their feet, and every step sank knee-deep in snow. To continue the ascent meant risking the lives of all 8. The group turned back. On August 21st, the first unofficial reports of Natalia Nagovitsina's death began to appear. Sources in the base camp, acquaintances of rescuers, cautious wording on social media. On August 23rd, the Kyrgyz authorities officially announced the cessation of active rescue operations. Dmitry Grekov, the operation coordinator, gives a detailed commentary to the press. The head of the base camp on Peak Pobeda, Vitaly Akimov, personally led the last rescue group that went out onto the ridge to Nagovitsina's location. But you need to understand the context. Before that, on the 16th, Vitaly was on board that same helicopter with the same team of rescuers that crashed and made a hard emergency landing on the slope. All the guys in that machine were seriously injured in the impact. Now, Vitaly has gone up again, led the group, and reached an altitude of 6,100 meters. There, he began to experience severe back pain, shooting pains in his spine. Apparently, the injury from the helicopter crash was more serious than it initially seemed. Adrenaline kept him going for the first few days, and then his body began to give out. Vitaly made the decision to turn the entire group around, ordered everyone to descend. It was the only reasonable decision under the circumstances. The rescue group was urgently evacuated by helicopter back to the Inalchek camp. Active rescue operations on Peak Pobeda are officially completely terminated. The head of the MES of Kyrgyzstan, Adil Chakdirov, gave a brief but meaningful comment to journalists. All the experts we have consulted agree Natalia Nagovitsina most likely died several days ago. But we cannot officially give such information and declare a person dead until medical personnel or rescuers check for a pulse and physically confirm death. It is now technically impossible to launch the drone with a camera due to the ongoing bad weather and strong wind at altitude. To officially, legally declare Natalia Nagovitsina deceased, search service employees or rescuers must ascend to the location and inspect the body. According to the legislation of the Kyrgyz Republic, until then, she will be listed as missing for another 5 years. The climbing season on Peak Pobeda is over. Temperatures have dropped, winds have intensified, and so much snow has fallen that the routes have become impassable. Therefore, it is likely that someone will reach the place where Natalia was left only in the spring or summer of 2026 at the earliest, when the new season begins. Although reports are already coming in from climbers that the tent has been completely blown away by the wind, it is simply not there. It's not a fact that the body will ever be found. Perhaps it fell from the ridge, perhaps it was covered with so much snow that it cannot be found. The body of the Italian Luca Sinigaglia, who died in a heroic attempt to save his friend, also still remains somewhere on the mountain at an altitude of 6,800 meters. Climber Natalia Nagovitsina will forever remain in the mountains of the Tian Shan. Whether she was alive in the last days of the rescue work, when the drone filmed her lying in her sleeping bag, it is difficult to say for certain, but it is quite plausible to assume that she was. The human body is capable of incredible things when it comes to survival. The question of bringing down the body in the next climbing season is also extremely complex and ambiguous. Most likely, it will not be brought down. The evacuation of a body from an altitude of over 7,000 meters along a technically difficult ridge could lead to additional human casualties among the rescuers. The risk is unjustified. Therefore, it is highly probable that Natalia will remain there, in the mountains, forever. But this is not the end of the story. Natalia has an adult son. Many media outlets, apparently to enhance the dramatic effect and increase the clickability of headlines, wrote that the boy was left an orphan. Look, they say, what irresponsible parents went to the mountains and abandoned their child. Of course, the loss of both parents is a huge, irreparable tragedy for any person. I express my deepest, sincere condolences to the family. But Natalia and Sergei Nagovitsin's son was 27 years old at the time of the events. He is an adult, independent person, and to call him a boy or a child is quite difficult and incorrect. The issue is not one of terminology. After Natalia's death and the completion of the large-scale, costly rescue operations, a sharp financial question arose, which was raised by the media and lawyers. Natalia Nagovitsina was insured before the trip for the sum of $35,000, standard insurance for high-altitude ascents. But the rescue operations, even before reaching their sad conclusion, and not to mention the hypothetical descent of the body, cost the budget of Kyrgyzstan and various organizations more than $60,000. Helicopters, fuel, pilots' work, payment for rescuers, medical assistance for the injured, evacuation, all of this costs money, and a lot of it. The missing difference of $25,000 must be paid by someone according to the law. The question is, who exactly? Provocative headlines began to appear in the media, such as, "Son of deceased climber will be forced to pay huge debt for rescue operation." People knowledgeable in legislation appeared in climbers' telegram groups and legal forums explaining the situation. According to them, in principle, this is legally possible and even likely. If a person officially accepts the inheritance of a deceased relative, they automatically inherit not only the property and assets, but also all the outstanding debts and financial obligations of the deceased. This is a basic norm of inheritance law, valid in most post-Soviet countries. Consequently, Natalia Nagovitsina's son could theoretically be presented with a bill for the payment of this large sum if he decides to accept his mother's inheritance. But for now, all of this is just unconfirmed expert opinions, lawyers' discussions on the internet, and sensational media headlines, not official court decisions. If I were to give my personal opinion, Peak Pobeda is undoubtedly and unequivocally the most technically difficult, dangerous, and unpredictable summit in the territory of the former Soviet Union. It is not just a high mountain. It is an objectively deadly route, even for very experienced professional climbers. In the comments under the news about the tragedy with Natalia, one could constantly find the typical mockery from armchair experts. Why did she even go there? It's her own fault she died. She shouldn't have gone where she wasn't wanted. They shouldn't have spent money on saving her. She chose such a fate herself. I do not share and categorically do not support this cynicism. A person, a free adult, is the master of their own life and consciously makes decisions about the risks acceptable to them. Natalia Nagovitsina did not direct the rescue work, did not organize the operation, did not personally call on anyone to go save her, did not demand help. She simply found herself in trouble. And those people who went to help another person in trouble, the Italian Luca, the German Günther, the Russian rescuers, the helicopter pilots, all of them also independently made a conscious decision about the risks to their own lives. They did it voluntarily, out of conscience, out of humanity. No one forced them. If you look at the situation from a purely cold, technical, mountaineering point of view, Natalia's chances of a real rescue were initially practically absolute zero. All experienced high-altitude climbers understood this perfectly from the very beginning. Basically, all the media hype and public outcry was stirred up by the media. How can this be? A Russian climber is stuck at altitude, dying, and for some reason the rescuers can't bring her down. It's a scandal, negligence. But for those people who are at least somewhat genuinely connected with high-altitude mountaineering, everything was absolutely clear and understandable from the very beginning. Even a group of 10 of the most experienced, strong, acclimatized, professional high-altitude climbers could not have brought her down by hand, especially since it would have taken at least a week to reach her in the most difficult conditions. The necessary specialized helicopter, capable of operating at an altitude of 7,000+ meters, was physically not available in Kyrgyzstan. Everything else was the personal decisions of specific people. Let's summarize the sad outcome of the operation. The deceased Italian climber Luca Sinigalia, 39 years old. The German Günther Sigmund is in extremely serious condition in a hospital in Bishkek, most likely with irreversible severe frostbite on his extremities, with possible amputation of fingers and toes. The pilot of the Mi-8 helicopter with a broken compression fracture of the spine, disability is practically guaranteed. Another 6 people from the crew and rescuers with various injuries to their back, ribs, and limbs from the hard emergency landing of the helicopter on the slope. Vitaly Akimov with a spinal injury sustained in the crash, who heroically tried to continue leading the operation until his body finally gave out. Dmitry Grekov, who made the final decisions, did absolutely everything right from the point of view of common sense and responsibility by ordering the last rescue group to immediately turn around and descend. Because otherwise, Vitaly Akimov, who had stubbornly set out on a most difficult ascent with a serious back injury, risked remaining in the mountains forever himself, adding to the list of the dead. Perhaps this opinion will seem strange, politically incorrect, or even outrageous to those who love to gasp and groan in the comments, "Oh my, what a bad, irresponsible woman! Why did she go to the mountains? They shouldn't have wasted resources on saving her at all." But I firmly believe the following. A person has a fundamental right to live as they see fit, to die as circumstances dictate, to put everything they personally consider permissible on the line in their personal projects, including even their own life. This is the basic right of a free individual. I will repeat for those who did not hear it the first time. Absolutely all the people who, in one way or another, participated in the attempts to save Natalia Nagovitsina did so of their own free will, consciously. She did not personally direct the rescue operations, did not draw up plans for the operation, did not personally call on anyone to risk their life for her salvation. People themselves, each individually, made the decision about the acceptability of the risks for themselves. Once again, I want to express my deepest, sincere condolences to all who personally knew Natalia Nagovitsina, were friends with her, and climbed with her in the mountains. This material was in no way intended to offend the memory of the deceased, and I very much hope that this was conveyed correctly. I will emphasize again, for the sake of objectivity, this reconstruction of events may well contain factual inaccuracies, insufficiently verified details, and errors in the chronology. Over time, more reliable information from direct participants in the events will certainly appear. But at the time of preparing this material, it contains absolutely all the information available in open sources that could be collected and verified.